The child vanished during a moment so ordinary that no one remembered it cleanly afterward. It was a Wednesday afternoon at the edge of fall, warm enough for open windows, but cool enough that parents lingered in their cars rather than stepping out. The elementary school released students in staggered waves, backpacks bouncing, voices overlapping, the ritual so familiar it barely registered. For most families, pickup took less than 2 minutes. For one family, it never ended. 9-year-old Caleb Mercer walked out with his class, crossed the painted crosswalk under the supervision of a volunteer, and headed toward the curb where his mother usually waited. Her car was not there yet. Traffic had slowed unexpectedly near the highway exit. Caleb did what he had been told to do dozens of times before. He waited. Witnesses later described him standing near the flagpole, shifting his weight, adjusting the strap of his backpack. He did not cry, he did not wander. He watched the cars pull up and leave, one by one. At 3:18 p.m., a dark SUV stopped at the curb beyond the pickup zone, hazard lights flashing. No one thought it was unusual. Vehicles stopped there all the time when parents were late or confused. The driver remained inside. The rear passenger door opened briefly, then closed. At 3:20, the SUV pulled away. By 3:27, Caleb Mercer was gone. The first assumption was a misunderstanding, that he had left with another parent, that he had walked to the office, that he was hiding somewhere, distracted, absorbed in a game only he understood. Teachers searched classrooms. Staff checked restrooms. The principal made a routine announcement over the intercom. Nothing. Caleb's mother arrived at 3:31, already apologizing as she parked, already scanning for his blue jacket. When she did not see him, she smiled at first, the practiced patience of a parent expecting a minor inconvenience. That smile lasted less than a minute. The school went into lockdown at 3:39. Police arrived quickly, lights off but visible. Officers spoke in low voices, radios turned down. The playground was cleared. The street was closed. Parents who had already left were called back, their confusion giving way to fear as the minutes stacked without explanation. Security footage told a story no one wanted. The cameras covered the exits, the crosswalk, the curb. They showed Caleb waiting. They showed the SUV arriving. They showed a man stepping out briefly, crouching, speaking to Caleb at eye level. The audio did not record, but the body language was clear, calm, familiar. Whatever was said did not alarm the boy. Caleb stepped forward on his own. The man placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, guiding rather than pulling. The rear door opened again. Caleb climbed inside. The door closed. The SUV left the frame. Total time, 12 seconds. There was no struggle, no urgency, no signal to bystanders that anything was wrong. The SUV's plates were obscured by glare. The make and model were common. The man's face was visible only in fragments. Baseball cap, sunglasses, neutral clothing. Nothing memorable by design. By nightfall, the story had spread beyond the town. A child, taken in daylight, from school grounds, without force. The detail that unsettled people most was not the boldness, but the ease. The way it resembled hundreds of harmless interactions parents had watched, without registering. A delayed pickup, a helpful adult, a calm suggestion. Caleb Mercer had not been dragged away. He had been convinced. Search teams worked through the night. Dogs tracked scent to the curb, then lost it completely. Roadblocks went up too late to matter. Tips flooded in, most of them noise. White vans, strangers at parks. Rumors, shaped by fear rather than fact. Inside the Mercer home, Caleb's room remained untouched. his shoes by the door, his homework unfinished on the table, his phone still charging because he was not allowed to bring it to school. The house was full of sound that night. Voices, phones ringing, officers moving through rooms. What it did not contain was any indication of why Caleb had been chosen. There were no custody disputes, no family enemies, no public presence, no reason for exposure. Caleb was not exceptional in any way that showed from the outside. He was bright, polite, unremarkable, the kind of child who blended easily into a group. That, investigators would later realize, was not incidental. It was essential. Somewhere beyond the school, beyond the quiet streets and closed garages, a plan had reached its most delicate moment. The taking had gone exactly as intended. No resistance, no witnesses who felt certain enough to intervene. The next phase would not depend on speed or violence. It would depend on patience, and on how long a child could be kept believing that what was happening was temporary, reasonable, and somehow his fault. The first call did not come that night. That absence unsettled investigators more than an immediate demand would have. Most kidnappings declared themselves quickly, before panic hardened into resolve, before law enforcement fully mobilized. Silence suggested either inexperience or something more deliberate. The man who had taken Caleb Mercer had not rushed. He had spoken calmly, shown his face, and driven away without urgency. Silence fit that pattern. Search operations expanded at dawn. Teams moved through wooded strips behind subdivisions, drainage culverts, abandoned sheds. Helicopters traced slow grids overhead. Officers knocked on doors, asking about unfamiliar vehicles, unusual noises, moments that felt wrong only in hindsight. People wanted to help. Many did not know how. The SUV became the center of gravity. Investigators released a still frame from the school camera, grainy and unsatisfying. It looked like dozens of other vehicles parked on dozens of other streets. Tips poured in anyway. Every dark SUV became suspect. The volume overwhelmed the signal. Caleb's classmates were interviewed gently, then again more carefully. Most remembered nothing. A few recalled seeing him talk to the man, but not what was said. One child said the man had smiled. Another thought he looked like someone's uncle. None thought he seemed dangerous. That detail lingered. Profilers urged restraint in interpretation. The absence of force did not imply kindness. It implied planning. The man had chosen a time and place where trust was ambient, where children were accustomed to adult direction, and compliance was routine. He had not needed to lie convincingly. He had only needed to sound certain. Late in the afternoon, Caleb's mother received a text message from an unknown number. It contained no threat. It read simply, "Caleb is safe." There were no instructions, no demand, no proof of life beyond the assertion itself. The message did not ask for a response. Investigators debated whether the sender wanted reassurance or control. In the end, they advised silence. Responding might encourage escalation. Not responding might provoke it. There was no correct answer, only trade-offs. They waited. The second message arrived just after midnight. "He misses you. Please don't involve anyone else." This time, the intent was clearer. The kidnapper was not asking for money. He was asking for isolation. He wanted to narrow the circle, to remove the systems that complicated his control. He framed it as concern, not threat. He positioned himself as caretaker rather than captor. Caleb's parents were instructed again not to respond. The phone was monitored, mirrored, its activity traced in real time. The number bounced through relays that obscured location, but analysts detected a pattern. The messages were being sent from different towers within a limited radius, suggesting movement rather than concealment. Caleb was not being held in one place. That realization shifted the investigation sharply. The absence of demands, the movement, the language of the messages, all pointed away from ransom. This was not about leverage. It was about possession. The kidnapper wanted time, not money. Time to normalize the situation, to reshape Caleb's understanding of what was happening. Psychologists warned that the longer that process continued, the harder extraction would become. Children adapted quickly, especially when fear was blended with routine. If the kidnapper maintained calm, provided food, structure, and reassurance, Caleb's resistance might fade into compliance. The third message confirmed the fear. It arrived the following morning, accompanied by a photo. Caleb sat at a small table, eating cereal. He wore the same jacket from the day before. His backpack rested against the wall behind him. He was not crying. He was not smiling. He looked tired, but intact. Beside the bowl was a folded piece of paper. Written on it in marker were the words, Day 1. The message that followed was brief. We're traveling. He's doing very well. The investigation narrowed its focus to transit corridors, rest stops, budget motels, campgrounds, places designed for anonymity and brief stays. The SUV's path was reconstructed through toll cameras and traffic sensors, not precisely but directionally. It moved west, then south, then west again, avoiding highways when possible. The kidnapper was not fleeing. He was wandering. That choice mattered. Wandering created uncertainty, but it also created habits. Fuel stops, food purchases, bathroom breaks. Children needed things adults could postpone. The man could not disappear completely. He would have to surface again and again in ordinary places. Officers were deployed to watch those places without drawing attention. Clerks were briefed. Camp hosts were alerted. School photos were circulated quietly. Inside the Mercer home, time collapsed into fragments. The parents slept in shifts. They replayed the footage endlessly, searching for a sign they had missed. Guilt crept in sideways, attaching itself to irrelevant decisions. Being late, not giving Caleb a phone, trusting the routine. The messages continued, 1 or 2 a day, always calm, always reassuring, always framed as temporary. He asked when he could see you. We read together tonight. He's very brave. Each message pulled at the same thread, the idea that this was an arrangement, not an abduction. That cooperation would bring resolution faster than resistance. Investigators recognized the tactic for what it was. The kidnapper was not trying to break the parents. He was trying to replace them. The breakthrough came from a place so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. A cashier at a roadside grocery store 30 miles south of the school called in a tip after seeing the photo circulated during a briefing. She had not been certain at first. The boy she saw did not look frightened. He stood patiently beside a man at the counter, holding a box of granola bars with both hands. What caught her attention was not the child, but the way the man corrected him. The boy reached for the wrong flavor. The man did not scold or grab. He simply adjusted the box back into the boy's hands and shook his head once, slowly, as if reinforcing a rule that had already been explained. The boy nodded immediately, without argument, and put the box back. The cashier remembered the compliance. She remembered it because it felt rehearsed. Security footage confirmed the sighting. The man paid in cash, spoke little, and left within 2 minutes. Outside, the boy climbed into the SUV on his own, buckled himself in, and waited while the man returned the cart. There was no urgency, no concealment, just routine. The footage was clear enough to offer more than fragments. The man was in his early 40s, clean cut, with the kind of face that slid easily out of memory. No visible tattoos, no distinctive gait. He dressed like someone who wanted to blend into middle distance, neither polished nor careless. The SUV's rear bumper bore a small dent on the left side. That detail mattered. Traffic cameras along secondary highways were rechecked with new parameters. Within hours, analysts identified the same vehicle moving through 3 counties over the previous 2 days, stopping briefly each time, never staying long. The pattern suggested movement without destination, a loop rather than an escape. The man was not running from something, he was sustaining something. Psychologists revisited the messages with this in mind. The language was consistent with someone establishing a temporary world, one where rules were simple and authority was clear. The kidnapper did not threaten consequences. He framed expectations as mutual understanding. The structure was quiet, but absolute. Caleb's behavior in the footage reflected it. He did not look terrified, he looked careful. That distinction alarmed investigators more than panic would have. Panic burned energy and drew attention. Carefulness endured. A plan formed quickly. Not a raid, not a confrontation. A pause. Investigators advised Caleb's parents to respond to the next message. The response was crafted carefully, stripped of emotion, written to mirror the kidnapper's tone. "Thank you for taking care of him. He has a dentist appointment soon. We don't want him to miss it." The message was not a demand. It was a reminder of routine, framed as concern. It reintroduced the idea that Caleb belonged to a life with scheduled obligations, that his current situation was not self-contained. The reply came within minutes. "We'll handle it." The phrasing was subtle but telling. The kidnapper did not dismiss the appointment. He absorbed it. He positioned himself as capable of replacing not just the parents' presence, but their function. Investigators pushed again. A second message followed an hour later. "He's been sleeping poorly. He does better when he hears your voices." This time, the request was explicit. A call. It was risky. A live call introduced variables no one could fully control. But it also created opportunity. Voices carried information. Background noise. Cadence. Environment. Most importantly, it allowed investigators to hear Caleb. The call came through at 9:47 p.m. Caleb's voice was softer than his parents remembered, but steady. He said he was okay. He said they were staying in different places. He said the man was nice, and that they were just waiting for something to be finished. The phrasing did not sound like a child's. It sounded practiced. Investigators listened closely to what Caleb did not say. He did not ask when he was coming home. He did not cry. He did not complain. He responded to questions with brevity, as if aware of time limits. In the background, there was a television playing softly. A game show. Canned applause. Somewhere public, not a private home. When the man took the phone, his voice was calm, measured, and careful. He did not threaten. He did not negotiate. He said only that Caleb was safe, and that involving more people would confuse him. The call lasted 3 minutes. That was enough. Audio analysts isolated the background sound and matched it to a regional broadcast schedule. The game show aired only on certain local stations at specific times. Combined with the earlier sightings, it narrowed the search area to a cluster of towns near a state park with multiple campgrounds and seasonal cabins. Officers moved quietly. The risk was not that the man would flee. The risk was that he would decide the experiment had run its course. Investigators understood now. that the kidnapping was not about money or revenge, or even the child alone. It was about control sustained through calm, about proving that a child could be redirected without force, that authority could be transferred simply by occupying the space long enough. If confronted aggressively, the man might not panic. He might conclude. Search teams focused on campgrounds that allowed cash payment and short stays. Late that night, a ranger reported an SUV matching the description parked near a primitive site, engine still warm. A man and a child had been seen earlier, walking near the tree line, the man's hand resting lightly at the child's back. Officers did not rush in. They waited. Because everything about the kidnapping so far suggested one thing clearly. The man would not react well to being surprised. He would react to losing control. The campsite was quiet, in the way places become quiet when they are being used carefully. A small fire burned low in a stone ring, more for presence than warmth. A folding table held 2 plates, cleaned and stacked. The SUV sat angled toward the access road, packed but not hurried. Everything suggested readiness without alarm. Caleb sat on a log near the edge of the light, drawing in the dirt with a stick. He did not look up when officers first appeared at the perimeter. He finished what he was drawing, placed the stick down neatly, and waited. The man stood slowly when he realized they were there. He did not reach for Caleb. He did not raise his voice. He did not run. His hands remained visible, palms open, as if he were demonstrating something rather than responding to danger. He looked briefly at the officers, then back at Caleb, and something like calculation crossed his face. This was not the ending he had planned. An officer approached Caleb first, lowering himself to the boy's eye level, speaking softly, using his name without urgency. Caleb hesitated, not in fear, but in uncertainty. He glanced once at the man behind him, a reflex that spoke volumes. Permission had become habit. The officer waited. After a moment, Caleb stood and walked forward on his own. The man exhaled slowly. The sound carried more weight than any protest could have. He did not resist when he was handcuffed. He did not argue or plead. When asked why he had taken the child, he gave an answer that was neither defensive nor dramatic. He said he wanted to see if it would work. He said children were taught to trust systems that failed them all the time, and he wanted to know how easily that trust could be redirected. He said he had not intended to hurt Caleb, and there was no evidence he had. Food had been regular, sleep enforced, rules consistent. The structure had been deliberate. Caleb was not a hostage. He had been a participant in something he could not name. Reunification was quiet and uneven. Caleb ran to his parents, then stopped short, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in tone and volume. It took time for him to cry. It took longer for him to stop watching the space behind them, expecting instruction. Doctors later described the damage as subtle but real. There were no bruises to explain, no singular trauma to point to. What had been altered was orientation. Caleb had learned, briefly, that authority could move without explanation, that safety could be reassigned. That lesson did not vanish when the man was taken away. The kidnapper pled guilty without negotiation. He did not seek publicity. He did not offer statements. In court, he listened calmly as the charges were read, nodding once, as if confirming details he already knew. The judge did not ask him why. Outside the courtroom, the story simplified quickly. A child taken. A child returned. A man arrested. Relief folded over fear. And the town moved forward the way towns always do, by reducing complexity until it fits into memory. At the elementary school, pickup procedures changed. New signs went up. New rules were printed and sent home. Parents arrived earlier. Teachers watched more closely. Caleb returned months later, quieter but present. He learned again how to wait for his mother by the curb, how to ignore adults who were not hers, how to trust selectively. What lingered was not the kidnapping itself, but the knowledge of how little force it had required. 12 seconds. A calm voice. A moment where nothing seemed wrong. That understanding stayed with the people who had watched it happen and almost missed it. Not as panic, but as a sharper awareness that safety was not always broken by violence. Sometimes it was undone by cooperation. Now, let's get into another story. The gunshot echoed across the lake before anyone saw the boat. Sound traveled strangely out there, flattening distance, making it impossible to tell direction. The people on the far shore thought it came from the woods. A fisherman closer to the marina assumed it was a firecracker. By the time the aluminum skiff drifted into view, bumping softly against the reeds, the moment had already passed. The man inside was slumped forward over the steering console, his hands still gripping the wheel. The engine idled unevenly, coughing every few seconds, pushing the boat in small, lazy circles. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark against the sunlit metal floor, spreading with each gentle turn. He had been shot once, point blank, just below the ear. The lake was recreational, not remote. Vacation homes lined parts of the shore. Kayakers moved through the coves in the mornings. Teenagers gathered at night near the boat ramp, drinking cheap beer and daring each other to swim out to the floating buoys. Violence did not belong there. It felt misplaced, like an intrusion that had not followed the rules. The man's name was Victor Hale. He was 58 years old and well known, though not well liked. He owned several bait shops around the county, the kind that sold live minnows, fishing licenses, and faded postcards of the lake in better decades. Locals described him as difficult but harmless, loud in opinion, careful with money, generous only when it benefited him later. He spent most mornings on the water, alone, tracing the same routes he had memorized years ago. On the day he died, he left the marina just after sunrise. Witnesses saw him load his cooler, check his fuel line, and wave off a teenager offering help. He wore no life jacket. He never did. The boat was found less than an hour later. There were no signs of a struggle. The gun had not been Victor's. No weapon was found on the boat or in the water nearby. The shot had been clean, fired from close enough to leave stippling along his jaw. Whoever pulled the trigger had been seated beside him or standing directly behind him. Someone Victor had allowed onto the boat. That detail unsettled the sheriff more than the murder itself. People did not climb into Victor Hale's boat uninvited. He was territorial, suspicious, quick to argue. He kept old grudges alive for sport. If someone had been with him that morning, it was because he wanted them there. Deputies worked the shoreline all day, questioning anglers, dock owners, early swimmers. Stories conflicted. Some recalled a second figure on the boat, though no one could describe them clearly. Others insisted Victor had been alone. The lake distorted memory as easily as sound. The autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested. Victor had not been caught off guard. His body showed no defensive movement, no attempt to turn away. He had been looking at the person who killed him when the trigger was pulled. By evening, rumors moved faster than facts. People spoke about debts, about arguments over dock space, about shouting matches in bait shops that ended with threats tossed casually into the air. Others whispered about a woman Victor had once been involved with, or a deal gone wrong years earlier that everyone remembered differently. None of it settled. What cut through the noise was something simpler and harder to explain. Victor Hale had made a call from his phone while out on the lake, 20 minutes before he died. Not to family, not to a business contact, not to emergency services. He had called the local number for the weather line. The automated system recorded the call as usual, logging the time and duration. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Long enough to hear the full lake forecast twice. Wind conditions, water temperature, visibility. Long enough for someone else to sit beside him in silence. Investigators stood on the dock as dusk settled, watching the lake darken into a smooth, reflective surface. Boats returned one by one, engines cutting, voices carrying briefly before fading. Somewhere out there, someone had shared a calm morning ride, listened to the weather together, and then ended a life without urgency. The lake kept its shape, the water closed. And whatever had happened aboard that skiff left no ripple that lasted longer than a breath. The lake gave nothing back. Divers swept the area where the skiff had been found, their movements slow and methodical, stirring silt that collapsed almost immediately. No gun surfaced, no dropped shoe, no stray shell casing. The water absorbed evidence the way it absorbed sound, evenly and without memory. Investigators turned instead to the marina, to the rituals that framed Victor Hale's mornings. He had been predictable to the point of superstition. Same slip, same departure window, same slow circuit past the northern coves before cutting across open water. People timed their own outings around his habits, either to avoid him or to trade a few minutes of conversation they would later complain about. The morning of the killing, Victor broke one small routine. He did not fuel up. That omission mattered. It suggested he did not expect to be out long. Whatever he planned to do on the lake was brief, contained, and known in advance. Phone records placed a second call before the weather line. A missed call, incoming from a prepaid number with no subscriber information. The call lasted less than 10 seconds. It rang once, maybe twice, then stopped. 2 minutes later, Victor called the weather line and stayed connected. Investigators stood on the dock and tried to picture the sequence. The missed call. The decision to call the weather line rather than call back. The wait. The engine idling. The calm. Victor Hale had been impatient by nature. He argued with clerks, snapped at customers, berated delivery drivers. Yet on the lake he was known to slow down, to drift rather than push. Something about being out there recalibrated him. That calm had been used. The bait shops offered little beyond texture. Employees recalled Victor arguing with suppliers about margins that barely mattered. Customers remembered him complaining about permits and inspections. Everyone had a story, none of them aligned in a way that pointed cleanly at motive. What did align were sightings from the previous week. Multiple people reported seeing Victor with someone else on the lake, not fishing, not working, just sitting. The second person was always vague in description. A jacket, a hat, a posture that did not stand out. Some assumed it was a relative. Others thought it was a tourist. No one asked. The sheriff focused on one account in particular. A woman who lived year-round in a small house near the North Shore described watching Victor's boat idle near the reeds while another boat passed. She noticed because Victor did not wave. He was turned inward, shoulders angled toward the other person. The boat drifted long enough that she assumed there was a problem. Then it moved on. She remembered, thinking it looked peaceful. Investigators reconstructed Victor's last week hour by hour. Receipts placed him at his shops. Cameras showed him closing up alone. His phone showed no emotional spikes, no late-night calls, no arguments that carried forward. The only anomaly was the prepaid number, which appeared 3 times over 6 days. Always brief, always unanswered or unreturned, always followed by a weatherline call within minutes. The pattern suggested coordination without conversation. The killer had not needed to persuade Victor. They had needed only to signal. Boat registration logs were pulled, though the lake allowed casual access. Dozens of small craft launched daily without record. Still, deputies noted a skiff that had appeared twice near Victor's usual routes, operated by a man who paid cash at the marina and never docked overnight. He rented by the hour, left no trash, asked no questions. Security footage caught him once, loading the boat alone. Average build. Neutral clothing. No distinguishing marks. He did not look like someone on vacation. He looked like someone completing a task. When deputies canvassed nearby towns with his image, no one recognized him. The weather line became a focal point. Investigators listened to the recording again, this time with attention to the background. Wind. Water. A faint metallic knock that repeated at uneven intervals. It matched the sound of a loose cleat striking aluminum, common on small boats. But it placed the phone on the skiff, not in a pocket. Victor had set it down and let it run. He had been buying time. The theory formed slowly, not as analysis but as instinct. Victor had known the person with him. Not intimately, not warmly, but enough to accept their presence without tension, enough to sit beside them and wait. The sheriff considered the possibility that Victor had not been lured at all, that the meeting had been his idea, that the weather call was not a stall, but a courtesy, a way to keep the moment neutral while something unsaid settled between them. Late that night, a deputy checking shoreline access points found something that had not been there before. A plastic bait bucket sat half hidden among the reeds near a private inlet. It was empty, clean, and dry, placed rather than discarded. Written on the lid in marker was a date from 3 years earlier. The ink was faded, but legible. Investigators traced the date to a boating accident that had never become a crime. A man drowned after falling from a skiff during an argument with Victor Hale over fishing rights near the same inlet. At the time, it had been ruled an accident. No charges, no witnesses willing to complicate it. The bucket had not been evidence then. Now it felt deliberate. Not a threat, not a message. A reminder left where only someone who knew the lake, and knew Victor, would understand its weight. The water around the inlet was still. The lake, once again, gave nothing away. But someone had begun to mark its surface, not with ripples, but with memory. The accident from 3 years earlier returned to the town unevenly, like a story told out of order. At the time, it had barely registered beyond a brief mention in the local paper. A man named Russell Moore, 41, seasonal contractor, drowned after falling from a boat during a dispute on the lake. Alcohol had been involved. No one could say who pushed whom, or if anyone had pushed at all. Victor Hale told deputies the man lost his balance. The water was cold that morning. The current was stronger than it looked. Tragic, but simple. The case closed itself. Now investigators reread the old reports with fresh eyes. Russell Moore had not owned a boat. He had been working on dock repairs that summer, moving between marinas, sleeping wherever he could. On the morning he died, he had accepted a ride from Victor, who was known to ferry workers across the lake for cash when it suited him. No one else had been present. Victor's statement from that day was characteristically brief. He had not raised his voice. He had not appeared shaken. He described the fall as sudden, unavoidable. He said he had tried to reach for the man, but it happened too fast. The lake had agreed. Russell Moore's family had pushed once for further review, then stopped. There was nothing to fight, no proof, no leverage. The water kept its silence. What unsettled investigators now was not the accident itself, but what followed it. Phone records showed that Victor had received several calls from an unknown number in the weeks after the drowning. Short calls, unanswered. Then none at all. The prepaid number that appeared before Victor's death had not existed then, but the pattern was familiar. Contact without conversation. The bait bucket felt less like a threat and more like a punctuation mark. Something placed to confirm that the past had been retrieved intact. The sheriff drove out to Russell Moore's last listed address, a rural property an hour north of the lake. The house was occupied now by someone else, but a neighbor remembered Russell clearly. He had been quiet, capable, prone to disappearing for days at a time. After the drowning, a woman had come by asking questions. She did not give a name. She asked where Russell had worked, who he spent time with, whether he had argued with anyone. The neighbor remembered her because she listened without interrupting. Investigators traced Russell's work history and found gaps that had never mattered before. Jobs that ended abruptly. Marinas that remembered him vaguely, then not at all. One foreman recalled that Russell had mentioned a sister once, though no family records listed one. Another remembered a woman who waited in a truck sometimes, engine running, watching the water while Russell worked. No one remembered her face clearly. Back at the lake, deputies walked the shoreline near the private inlet where the bucket had been found. The reeds shifted softly in the breeze. The water there dropped off sharply, colder and darker than the surrounding shallows. It was a place locals avoided without quite knowing why. The sheriff stood there longer than necessary, imagining the morning of the accident, the argument, the movement of the boat, the moment where balance became momentum, whether Victor had reached out, or paused, or done nothing at all. Intent was slippery on water. That afternoon, the prepaid number went active again. It called the weather line once, stayed connected for just over a minute, then disconnected. The call originated from a cell tower near the lake, but not near the marina, somewhere farther north, closer to the inlet. No one died. The call felt like something else, a check, a measurement, the equivalent of standing on the shore and throwing a stone just to see how far it would go. Investigators increased patrols around the lake, visibly this time. Boats moved in pairs. Lights cut across the water at night. The effect was immediate and unsatisfying. The lake grew quiet in the way people grow quiet when they are being watched. Days passed without incident. Then a marina clerk reported something that felt insignificant until it wasn't. A woman had come in asking about hourly rentals. She paid cash. She did not take a boat. She asked which routes were busiest in the early morning and which coves stayed empty the longest. When the clerk asked what kind of fishing she planned to do, the woman smiled and said she did not fish. She left without renting anything. Security footage caught her from behind. Her face never turned fully toward the camera. She wore a jacket despite the heat, the collar raised high enough to obscure her profile. She moved without hesitation, as if she already knew where she was going. The sheriff watched the footage twice, then a third time. The case was no longer about Victor Hale alone. It was about time, and water, and the way certain moments never resolved, only waited. Whatever had happened on the lake 3 years earlier had not ended when the water closed over it. It had drifted, and now it had found its way back to the surface, calm, patient, and very much unfinished. The lake changed once the patrols arrived. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to on a map. It changed in temperament. Boats moved less freely. Conversations on docks shortened. People glanced longer at one another before turning away. The water still looked the same, but the sense that it belonged to everyone weakened. It felt claimed. The prepaid phone surfaced one final time 3 nights later. It did not call the weather line, it called Victor Hale's phone. The device was still active, still logged into the network as evidence, still carried by an investigator assigned to monitor it. When it rang, the screen displayed the same blank number that had hovered at the edges of the case from the beginning. The call lasted 6 seconds. No sound came through. No breathing. No background noise. Just an open line that closed on its own. Investigators understood the timing immediately. The call was not meant for Victor. It was meant to mark closure. An acknowledgement that the intended recipient was gone, and that the person responsible knew it. The sheriff ordered one last sweep of the lake, focused not on Victor's route, but on Russell Moore's. Divers returned to the inlet where the accident had occurred. This time they searched closer to shore, along the submerged tree roots and collapsed stone that marked the old dock line. The work was slow and unpleasant. The water there was colder, heavier. Visibility dropped to nothing within a foot. They found the skiff anchor first. It was old, corroded, half buried in silt. Not Victor's. Not registered to anyone currently using the lake. The rope attached to it was cut cleanly, not frayed or snapped. Nearby, wedged beneath a submerged beam, they found a folding knife. The blade was nicked. The handle warped from long exposure. It matched the description of a knife Russell Moore's family said he carried. The implication was restrained but devastating. Russell had not simply fallen. There had been a struggle, brief and decisive, that ended with a release rather than a rescue. Victor Hale had not pushed him outright. He had let go. Legally, the distinction still mattered. Practically, it did not. The sheriff stood on the shore as the evidence was brought up, water streaming back into the lake that had kept it for 3 years. He understood then why there would be no arrest tied to Victor's death, no public resolution that satisfied the shape of the story. The person who killed Victor Hale had not come to the lake seeking justice in any formal sense. There had been no demand, no confrontation, no attempt to involve the system that had failed Russell Moore so easily. The killing had been private, contained, and exact. Victor had been allowed the same courtesy Russell had not received. Time to sit, time to listen to the weather, time to understand where he was and who was beside him. Time to feel the lake before it took something away. The woman seen at the marina was never identified. The prepaid phone was never recovered. No one reported seeing a second boat leave the area the morning Victor died, though the water showed signs of recent traffic if you knew how to read it. The case closed quietly, categorized in language that avoided the word revenge. Victor Hale's death was recorded as a homicide with insufficient evidence to proceed. Russell Moore's case was amended, not reopened. The lake returned to use. Summer moved in. The teenagers came back at night. Kayaks slid through the coves in the mornings. The wind carried sound the way it always had, bending it, flattening it, making certainty impossible. People still talked about Victor from time to time, usually with a shrug. Some said he had it coming. Others said no one deserved that end. The story softened as it spread, losing its edges, becoming something easier to live with. What remained sharp was invisible. Somewhere between the reeds and the open water, the lake held the memory of two men in a moment where one chose not to act. It did not judge. It did not preserve blame. It simply remembered. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Now, let's get right into another story. The voicemail was 17 seconds long and contained no words. It was left on the phone of a local radio station that no longer aired live programming overnight, only syndicated music and automated weather updates. The message captured breathing, slow and deliberate, followed by a faint rhythmic sound that engineers initially assumed was interference. At the 14-second mark, the sound stopped. The breathing continued for 2 more seconds. Then the line went dead. The station manager deleted it without listening twice. 2 hours later, a jogger found the body. It lay at the base of a pedestrian footbridge that crossed a narrow drainage canal on the east side of the city. The bridge was unremarkable, poured concrete, chain-link sides, used mostly by people cutting between neighborhoods. The body was positioned on its back beneath the arch, head resting against the sloped embankment, as if arranged to look upward at the underside of the bridge. There was no blood. The man had been stabbed once, directly beneath the ribcage, the blade angled upward with precision. The wound was small, almost surgical. Death would have been fast, but not immediate. The medical examiner would later estimate 30 to 40 seconds of consciousness, long enough to understand what was happening and long enough to feel it end. The victim's name was Andrew Hortman, 46 years old, divorced, no children. He worked as a building inspector for the city, a job that kept him in unfamiliar places at irregular hours. He was methodical, quiet, and according to co-workers, forgettable in the way that made him good at his work. He noticed things other people missed, then documented them without commentary. There was nothing missing from his pockets. Wallet, keys, phone, all present. The phone showed no recent calls, except one outgoing voicemail at 2:14 a.m., sent to the radio station. Investigators returned to the bridge before sunrise. The canal water moved sluggishly beneath it, carrying debris that caught briefly on the concrete supports before drifting free. The area smelled faintly of wet earth and oil. Traffic above the bridge was steady, the sound constant enough to flatten individual moments into a continuous hum. They noted what was not there. No signs of struggle. No defensive wounds. No hesitation marks around the injury. The killer had approached close enough to strike cleanly, then stepped back and watched. A single shoe print was found in the damp soil near the embankment. It was partial, the tread common, the size unremarkable. It offered no urgency. Whoever had stood there had not shifted weight or pivoted quickly. The print suggested stillness. Surveillance cameras from nearby intersections showed Andrew walking alone toward the bridge just after 2 a.m., his pace unhurried. He paused briefly at the top of the incline, possibly to check his phone. The next camera picked him up on the far side of the bridge, already wounded, already staggering. He collapsed out of frame seconds later. The killer never appeared on camera. Investigators reconstructed the moment with uncomfortable clarity. The approach would have been silent, masked by traffic noise. The angle of the stab required closeness, confidence, and a steady hand. There was no attempt to disguise the act as robbery or self-defense. It was not reactive. It was deliberate and contained. The voicemail shifted from curiosity to artifact. Audio technicians isolated the background sound. It was not interference. It was footsteps on concrete, measured and even, followed by a brief change in acoustics consistent with moving under a structure. The breathing was not labored. It was controlled. Andrew had made the call while walking. The call had not been a plea for help. There was no urgency in the breathing, no spike in pace. It was as if he had been instructed to leave the line open, or compelled to do so by proximity rather than threat. Psychologists consulted early offered a restrained assessment. The killer had not acted out of rage or panic. The act suggested rehearsal, but not obsession. There was no embellishment, no signature beyond efficiency. The voicemail, however, introduced something else. It was not a message meant to be heard. It was an audience. Someone had wanted the act to be accompanied, not remembered, but shared in real time, even if anonymously, even if without response. The breathing was not Andrew's alone. There was a second rhythm beneath it, slower, steadier, almost synchronized. Two people walking together. one of them knowing exactly how the night would end, and choosing, for reasons not yet visible, to make sure someone else was quietly present when it happened. Investigators returned to the voicemail with a different assumption. It was no longer treated as something Andrew had chosen to leave behind. It was something he had been allowed to make. Audio analysis separated the breathing into two distinct patterns. One was slightly elevated, consistent with walking uphill. The other was slower, almost metronomic. When the footsteps changed cadence under the bridge, both breathing patterns adjusted at the same moment. Two people had altered pace together. This suggested proximity without contact, a condition that narrowed the possibilities. The killer had been close enough to regulate Andrew's movement without touching him, close enough to control behavior through presence alone. The knife had come later. Investigators examined Andrew's recent work assignments, looking not for motive but for exposure. As a building inspector, he moved through unfinished structures, vacant properties, and redevelopment sites. He documented violations and issued notices that rarely carried emotional weight, yet sometimes resulted in costly delays. His role created inconvenience rather than conflict. People did not argue with him. They waited for him to leave. In the 3 weeks before his death, Andrew had filed an unusual cluster of reports related to a decommissioned industrial corridor near the canal. Old warehouses were being converted into mixed-use properties, the kind of transitional zone that attracted contractors working under compressed timelines. Andrew's notes were detailed, unusually so, flagging structural concerns that halted work at 2 sites indefinitely. There were no threats attached to those reports, no complaints filed, no appeals submitted. The stoppages had simply been absorbed, another friction point in a slow project. When investigators interviewed contractors associated with the sites, they encountered a common refrain. Andrew had been polite, quiet, and difficult to rush. He had not raised his voice or argued. He had simply stood in place, reviewed his checklist, and written what he observed. One contractor remarked that Andrew had a way of lingering, of standing still and watching after the inspection was technically over, as if confirming something internally before leaving. That detail stood out. The bridge where Andrew was killed sat 2 blocks from the edge of the same redevelopment zone. It was not the shortest route home, but it was the most direct from the canal side sites. Andrew had used it often enough that his presence there would not have been remarkable. What was remarkable was the timing. Andrew had clocked out hours earlier. There was no scheduled inspection that night. His phone records showed no incoming calls, no messages, no reason to be there at that hour except habit or instruction. Investigators reconstructed Andrew's last evening through fragments. He had eaten alone at a diner near City Hall, paid in cash, and left just before midnight. The waitress recalled nothing unusual, only that he lingered over coffee longer than usual. Security footage showed him seated, looking past the window rather than at his phone. He did not appear distracted or distressed. The possibility emerged that Andrew had been approached earlier, not with force, but with conversation. Someone who introduced themselves casually, perhaps under the guise of work-related familiarity. Someone who asked him to walk, to show something, to talk. The voicemail could have been suggested as a harmless act, a way to prove he was not alone, or a test of compliance disguised as reassurance. There was no evidence Andrew tried to escape. The knife wound supported this. The angle indicated Andrew had been facing his attacker. He had not turned away. His arms bore no marks of restraint or defense. The killer had stood close, visible, unhurried. The partial shoe print near the embankment was re-examined. It belonged not to the killer, but to Andrew. His foot had shifted once, subtly, just before he collapsed. The killer's own footprint was absent, likely because they stood on the concrete slope rather than the soil. They had chosen the firmer ground. This was not opportunistic. The killer selected the bridge because it offered acoustics, cover, and control. The constant traffic noise flattened sound. The arch distorted distance. A person could stand inches away and still feel isolated. It was a place where proximity did not feel dangerous until it was too late. The radio station voicemail gained new significance as well. It had been sent not to emergency services or a contact, but to a place that would not answer, a number that would not interrupt. The killer had allowed Andrew to believe he was leaving a trace while ensuring it would not summon help. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was precision. Psychological consultants reframed their earlier assessment. This was not a person who enjoyed chaos or dominance in the abstract. This was someone who valued control expressed through consent, shaped by circumstance. Andrew had walked with them. Andrew had breathed alongside them. Andrew had participated until participation no longer mattered. Investigators began canvassing areas around the canal for reports of unusual encounters that did not escalate. People who recalled being approached by someone who asked questions that felt slightly off, who suggested walking routes, who matched pace without explanation. These encounters, if they existed, would not have been reported at the time. They would have felt like nothing. That was the problem. The killer did not need to frighten. They needed to normalize. And somewhere in the city, a person had learned that they could move beside someone unnoticed, guide them without touch, and end a life without resistance. Once learned, that knowledge did not expire on its own. It waited for the next walk. The first usable lead came from a place no one had been looking. A transit analyst reviewing pedestrian traffic near the canal noticed a subtle anomaly in the data, pulled from motion sensors used to adjust streetlight brightness. The system tracked movement density, not individuals, but it revealed something strange in the weeks before Andrew's death. On several nights, pairs of pedestrians moved together along the same route at identical speeds, then separated abruptly near the bridge. In most cases, one continued on while the other turned back. There were no corresponding calls for service, no reported confrontations, just brief convergences that dissolved without incident. Investigators cross-referenced the timestamps with CCTV footage. In several instances, they caught glimpses of two figures walking side by side, close but not touching. No conversation was visible. Their body language was synchronized in a way that felt rehearsed rather than familiar. They did not look like friends. They looked like strangers temporarily aligned. In none of those cases did anyone die. The killer had practiced restraint. Witness canvassing expanded again, this time with a different question. Detectives stopped asking if anyone had seen something threatening and began asking if anyone remembered an encounter that felt oddly cooperative, a walk taken without knowing why, a conversation that seemed to steer rather than engage. A break came from a woman who worked late shifts at a print shop near the redevelopment zone. She described an encounter weeks earlier with a man who matched no distinctive profile. Average height, unremarkable clothing. He had fallen into step beside her after she left work, commenting casually on the construction delays in the area. He mentioned inspections, spoke with familiarity but not authority. At some point he suggested a different route home, mentioning better lighting. She followed for half a block before stopping abruptly, struck by the realization that she did not know why she was listening. When she stopped, he stopped. When she asked if she knew him, he smiled, apologized, and walked away. She had not thought about it again until she saw the news. The encounter fit too well to ignore. Investigators reconstructed the interaction from her description. The man had not pressured her. He had offered suggestions framed as shared observations. He had relied on politeness and momentum. When momentum broke, he disengaged without escalation. This aligned with Andrew's final moments. The killer did not coerce through fear. They leveraged social compliance, the instinct to maintain harmony, to avoid awkwardness, to keep moving once movement began. The knife was not the primary tool. It was the conclusion. Detectives returned to Andrew's voicemail once more, this time focusing not on sound, but on timing. The call had been placed exactly 4 minutes before Andrew reached the bridge, long enough to establish presence, short enough to remain continuous until the act. Phone records revealed something else. Andrew's phone had briefly connected to a nearby device via Bluetooth just before the call began. The connection lasted less than 10 seconds and did not exchange data. It was enough to trigger a prompt on Andrew's phone asking whether to pair. Someone had been close enough to attempt a connection. The act was unnecessary for functionality. It served only one purpose: to confirm proximity. Investigators theorized that the killer had used the attempt to prompt Andrew into initiating the call, possibly under the guise of a technical issue or casual suggestion. The killer did not need access to the phone. They needed Andrew engaged, compliant, and walking. Attention turned to the redevelopment sites again, not for conflict, but for observation. Andrew had spent hours in those areas, often alone, often on foot. Anyone watching could learn his habits without effort. Anyone patient could wait for the right night. The killer had chosen Andrew not because of who he was, but because of how he moved. Predictable, solitary, cooperative by nature. This reframed the crime as selective rather than random. The killer did not need many victims. One was sufficient if the process itself was satisfying. That possibility narrowed urgency. There might never be another body. Or there might be one only when the conditions aligned perfectly again. Investigators faced a difficult truth. Traditional deterrence would not work. The killer was not seeking recognition or repetition. They had completed something. Whether they would do it again depended not on compulsion, but on opportunity and desire. Surveillance increased subtly around pedestrian corridors, not with visible patrols, but with observers trained to notice synchronization. People who adjusted pace to match strangers. People who lingered at thresholds where routes converged. Days passed without incident. Then a transit officer reported something small but precise. Late one evening, near the same bridge, a man stood at the top of the incline, watching foot traffic without appearing to wait for anyone. When a pedestrian approached, the man stepped forward, then stopped. He adjusted his pace twice, testing alignment, then disengaged and turned away. The officer noted the behavior because it felt incomplete, like a sentence cut short. Cameras captured the man's face clearly for the first time. He was not distinctive. That, finally, was what made him visible. He moved like someone accustomed to blending, but he hesitated in a way that suggested uncertainty. Something had changed. Whether it was fear or satiation, or the awareness of scrutiny was unclear. What was clear was that the killer had returned to the bridge, not to kill, to see if the walk still worked. The man did not know he had been noticed. That was the mistake. Investigators did not move on him immediately. They watched instead, letting the moment stretch. The killer, if that was what he still was, lingered near the bridge for nearly 20 minutes, testing proximity with passing pedestrians in subtle ways. A step forward, a pause, a recalibration of distance. Each time he withdrew before full alignment could form. It was rehearsal without commitment. When he finally left, he did so along a route that cut back toward the redevelopment corridor. He walked with the same unhurried pace captured on earlier footage, posture neutral, hands visible. There was no sign of agitation. If anything, there was disappointment, faint but detectable, in the slowing of his stride once he believed he was alone. Surveillance teams followed at a distance that preserved anonymity. The man entered a mid-rise apartment building that backed onto one of the partially converted warehouse blocks. He used a key. The door closed behind him without urgency. Records confirmed what investigators suspected. He lived alone, worked irregular hours as a subcontractor on redevelopment sites, hired and released project to project. His name appeared in no complaints, no incident reports. He had never interacted directly with Andrew Hortman in any documented capacity. He had only been present. The apartment offered little at first glance. Sparse furnishings, no weapons visible, no memorabilia, no trophies. The walls were bare, the refrigerator nearly empty. Everything suggested impermanence, as if the space were transitional rather than lived in. What mattered was found in a drawer beside the bed. Inside were notebooks, thin and unmarked. They did not contain plans or fantasies. They contained observations, routes taken by pedestrians, notes about walking speed, posture, eye contact, marginal comments about when someone slowed unconsciously, when they adjusted to match another person without realizing it. Andrew's name appeared once, not as a target, as a notation. The entry described Andrew's gait, his tendency to pause at thresholds, his habit of walking without headphones. The final line was brief and precise, suitable. When confronted, the man did not deny the killing. He described it without emphasis, as if recounting a completed task. He explained that he had wanted to know whether it was possible to guide someone all the way to death without force until the final moment. Whether consent shaped by momentum could carry that far. He acknowledged the voicemail as part of the experiment, not for proof, for continuity. He wanted the walk to feel uninterrupted, accompanied. The radio station had been chosen because it would not answer. When asked why Andrew, the answer was unadorned. Andrew had been available, predictable, open to redirection. The choice had not been personal. There was no stated intent to kill again. That too was honest. The man explained that the act had answered the question he cared about. Repetition would not improve the result. He had returned to the bridge only to see whether the conditions still aligned, whether the walk could still be initiated. When it did not, he left. The killing had not awakened something. It had concluded something. Psychological evaluation later supported the assessment. The man did not exhibit compulsive violence or escalating fantasy. He had sought a specific experiential proof and stopped once it was obtained. The danger lay not in what he wanted next, but in how little resistance he required to achieve what he wanted at all. The case closed quietly. There were no public warnings about walking alone. No press conference explaining how proximity could be weaponized. The details were deemed too abstract, too likely to provoke fear without offering protection. Andrew's death was recorded as a homicide without known motive, resolved through investigative diligence. The voicemail was logged as evidence and archived. The bridge remained open. People continued to walk across it every night, adjusting pace unconsciously, matching strangers for a few steps before diverging. The behavior was ordinary. It had always been ordinary. What changed was invisible. Somewhere in the city's quiet systems, the knowledge remained that a man had died not because he resisted, but because he did not. That the most dangerous moment had not been the knife, but the first step taken together without question. That understanding did not alter the city's movement. It simply followed alongside it. Now, let's begin the next story for tonight. The first robbery left behind a pattern of damage that felt deliberate rather than chaotic. The front windows of the convenience store on East Merrill Road had been struck twice with a tire iron before the glass finally collapsed inward, a sequence that suggested patience and control. Inside, the aisles were untouched except for the counter area, where the register had been torn free of its mount and dropped hard onto the floor. The clerk survived with a fractured cheekbone and a concussion, but the violence had arrived without warning and ended just as abruptly, leaving the building oddly intact for a place that had been violated. The town was Larkspur, Ohio, a river-adjacent sprawl of older neighborhoods and newer logistics parks that had grown unevenly over 2 decades. It sat between 2 highways, close enough to the city to feel connected and far enough away to retain habits of self-reliance. Violent crime was not unknown, but it tended to follow recognizable routes, domestic disputes that turned physical or bar fights that escalated too far. Armed robberies were rarer, and ones that involved serious injury were almost unheard of. Within 12 hours, the store footage had been pulled and reviewed. The cameras had captured a figure in a dark hooded jacket and gloves, face concealed by a tight black mask. The person moved quickly, but not frantically, striking the clerk once, seizing the register, then exiting through the broken window rather than the door. The exit choice stood out to investigators, as if speed mattered less than avoiding the expected path. No vehicle appeared on camera, and no witnesses reported seeing anyone flee. 3 days later, a similar robbery occurred less than 4 miles away at a small pharmacy near the riverfront. This time, the pharmacist was struck twice and left bleeding on the tile floor while the assailant emptied the safe. The damage pattern repeated, the same forced window, the same focus on cash rather than drugs, the same lack of interest in anything that could be resold easily. The violence escalated in severity, but not in duration. Each incident was over in under 2 minutes. Colton Spear reviewed the reports in his office at the Larkspur Police Department, the late afternoon light slanting through the blinds and striping the desk with dust and paper. He had spent most of his career working property crimes, and his instincts were attuned to patterns of opportunity rather than rage. What unsettled him was the restraint embedded in the brutality. Whoever was committing these robberies was not losing control. They were choosing when and how to inflict harm, then stopping. The department assembled a small task group rather than calling in outside agencies, partly out of confidence and partly out of pride. Larkspur had solved its own problems for years. Troy Marino was assigned to canvass nearby businesses and residences after the second robbery, focusing on foot traffic and possible escape routes. He found little beyond vague recollections of a dark figure moving quickly, head down, blending into the evening. Lily Hawkins was brought in from the county prosecutor's office to advise on charging strategies should a suspect be identified. She approached the case with a careful eye toward escalation. 2 violent robberies in quick succession suggested either a learning curve or a test of limits. Her concern was not only who was responsible, but how quickly the behavior might evolve. Jack Stewart, a crime analyst with a background in geographic profiling, began mapping the incidents against transit corridors, lighting patterns, and response times. His early analysis showed that both locations sat within a narrow band of the city where foot access to the river trail system allowed rapid movement without cameras. It was a corridor used by joggers and cyclists during the day and largely empty after dark. The third robbery happened before any of the preliminary findings could be acted upon. It occurred at a liquor store just off the trail, a location that had been flagged as vulnerable but not yet visited by patrol. The clerk was hospitalized with a broken arm and internal injuries. The assailant left behind a single glove near the shattered window, black and unmarked, dropped in haste or indifference. The glove was processed overnight. It yielded no immediate DNA match, but fibers embedded in the fabric were unusual, a blend of industrial insulation and fine wood dust. The materials suggested proximity to construction or renovation work, possibly a warehouse or older structure undergoing repair. It was a small detail, but it shifted the direction of the investigation from pure opportunism toward a more grounded daily routine. Public concern intensified quickly. Local news outlets began running segments on the robberies, using language that hinted at a spree. Residents adjusted their schedules. Businesses closed earlier, and the police department increased visible patrols along the river corridor. The increased presence did not deter the assailant, but it did compress the window of opportunity. Colton noticed something else in the timelines. The robberies were not evenly spaced. Each occurred on a different day of the week, but within a similar 2-hour window in the early evening. It was a time when stores were staffed lightly and customers were sparse, but it was also a time when someone with a day job might reasonably be free. The thought was not novel, but combined with the fiber evidence, it began to form a profile that felt uncomfortably ordinary. Troy's canvassing eventually reached a small cluster of older warehouses near the river. Some converted into studios, and others left vacant. One building showed signs of recent interior work, insulation exposed near a broken loading dock door. The owner reported nothing missing and no suspicious activity, but the timing of the renovations aligned loosely with the start of the robberies. It was not enough to warrant a search, but it was enough to linger in the mind. Lily reviewed the injury reports with a clinical focus. The strikes were targeted, aimed at disabling rather than killing, but the force used was increasing. She considered whether the assailant was testing thresholds, learning how much violence was required to achieve compliance. The pattern suggested a person who was calibrating, not reacting. Jack refined his maps, overlaying patrol routes and response times. He noted that the assailant seemed to strike just outside the fastest zones, areas where response lagged by a few minutes. It implied either reconnaissance or luck, but repeated luck was statistically unlikely. Someone was watching. As the week progressed, the department received a tip from a resident who lived near the trail. The caller reported seeing a person lingering near the liquor store in the afternoons, dressed in work clothes, carrying a backpack. The description was vague and non-threatening, the kind of detail that often dissolved under scrutiny. Still, it was logged and added to the growing file. Colton felt the pressure of time begin to assert itself. Each robbery increased the likelihood of a fatal outcome, not necessarily because the assailant intended it, but because escalation had its own momentum. He knew that violence, once practiced, became easier to deploy. The team met again late Friday evening, the room quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Maps and photographs covered the table, a mosaic of partial truths and unanswered questions. Outside, the river trail lay dark and empty, a ribbon of asphalt threading through the city. Somewhere within that corridor, someone was preparing for another attempt, adjusting their approach, carrying forward a pattern that had not yet reached its end. The fourth robbery broke the rhythm the investigators thought they understood. It did not occur near the river or along the mapped corridor. Instead, it took place at a family-owned hardware store on the west side of town, a location surrounded by residential streets and distant from the trail system. The assailant entered through the front door just before closing, struck the owner with a metal bar taken from a display rack, and emptied the register without attempting to damage the safe. The violence was sharper and more personal, delivered at close range, and followed by a brief pause that security footage later revealed as a moment of observation rather than hesitation. Colton absorbed the shift with unease. The earlier robberies had suggested planning, a preference for controlled exits and predictable environments. This incident felt exploratory, as though the assailant were testing a different posture, measuring how it felt to confront someone face to face without the barrier of shattered glass. The choice of weapon was opportunistic, not brought in advance, which contrasted with the earlier use of a tire iron carried from outside. The department faced public pressure that escalated overnight. The hardware store owner was well known in Larkspur, and the attack resonated differently than assaults on clerks who were perceived, unfairly, as transient. Local radio hosts framed the robberies as a sign of decay, and city council members began asking whether outside assistance was necessary. The police chief resisted, insisting the pattern still belonged to the city. Troy expanded canvassing efforts westward, retracing the assailants' movements through residential blocks where cameras were scarce and lighting uneven. He noted something subtle in the footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera. The figure passed by at a steady walking pace, not running, shoulders relaxed, despite the proximity of houses. It suggested confidence, or familiarity with the area. People tend to move differently in places they know. Lily focused on the escalation curve. The injuries from the hardware store were less severe than those from the liquor store, despite the closer proximity. She considered whether the assailant had recalibrated, perhaps startled by the intimacy of the encounter. Violence that is abstract can be managed like a task, but violence that involves recognition carries psychological weight. The shift could indicate an internal boundary being tested and partially rejected. Jack revisited the glove fibers in light of the new location. Hardware stores attracted contractors, renovators, and maintenance workers, people who moved easily between industrial and residential spaces. He overlaid recent building permits with the robbery sites and identified a cluster of small renovation projects scattered across Larkspur, many tied to short-term contracts rather than long-term employment. It was not a list of suspects, but it narrowed the universe. The department received another tip, this one from an emergency room nurse, who noticed a patient with a deep cut on his hand the night of the hardware store robbery. The injury was consistent with broken glass or sharp metal, and the patient claimed it occurred during a home repair accident. The name was logged, but the alibi checked out on paper, supported by a neighbor. Still, the coincidence lingered. Colton began to suspect that the assailant was adapting in response to police presence. Patrols along the river corridor had increased, compressing familiar routes and forcing experimentation. The West Side robbery felt like a probe, a way to see how quickly attention would shift. It also suggested impatience. The earlier methodical approach was giving way to risk. The fifth robbery confirmed that impression. It occurred 2 nights later at a small grocery near the edge of town, just outside municipal limits. The assailant struck the cashier once, took cash from 2 registers, and fled through the back door into an alley that led toward a construction site. Patrol units arrived within minutes, but found no trace beyond muddy footprints that dissolved into tire tracks and debris. The construction site was active, a multi-building development scheduled for completion in 6 months. Workers came and went at all hours, and the site's security cameras were pointed inward, not toward the surrounding streets. The muddy footprints were useless, but the environment reinforced the theory that the assailant moved comfortably through spaces marked by disorder and noise. Public fear hardened into vigilance. Business owners hired private security or closed early, and residents reported unfamiliar faces with increasing frequency. The volume of tips strained the department, forcing triage and increasing the risk that something important would be overlooked. Colton convened a smaller meeting with Troy, Lily, and Jack, limiting the discussion to what could be proven rather than what felt true. They agreed on several points. The assailant likely lived or worked within Larkspur. The robberies followed a schedule compatible with daytime obligations. The violence was instrumental, not expressive, but the threshold for harm was rising. Most importantly, The pattern suggested a person who was learning, adjusting, and refining. Jack presented a revised geographic profile that incorporated the west side and the grocery store location. The map no longer formed a clean corridor, but a loose ring around a central zone of warehouses, small construction projects, and transitional housing. It was not elegant, but it reflected reality. Criminal behavior rarely adhered to ideal shapes. Lily raised the question of motive beyond money. The amounts stolen were modest, inconsistent with the risk. There was no attempt to steal high-value items or to launder proceeds through obvious channels. She considered whether the robberies served another purpose, perhaps rehearsing control or asserting power in a life otherwise constrained. It was a psychological hypothesis, not evidence, but it influenced how she imagined the person behind the mask. Troy followed up on the emergency room tip, expanding the search to include other injury reports that coincided with robbery dates. He found 2 more cases, both involving hand lacerations attributed to work accidents. One patient worked for a small contracting firm that had recently bid on projects near the river and the west side. The firm employed fewer than 10 people, all locals. The department requested employment records and schedules, a move that required careful justification to avoid alerting the wrong person. Colton authorized it quietly, aware that premature attention could push the assailant into more desperate acts. As the investigation narrowed, the robberies paused. Days passed without incident, a silence that felt heavy rather than reassuring. Colton understood that pauses could mean planning, not retreat. Violence rarely ended because of conscience alone. Late one evening, a patrol officer reported a suspicious individual near the construction site by the grocery store. The person was carrying a backpack and wearing work clothes, lingering longer than necessary. By the time the officer circled back, the individual was gone. The team gathered the next morning, tension evident in the way files were handled, and coffee went untouched. They were close enough to feel the heat of the target, but not close enough to grasp it. Somewhere in Larkspur, someone was adjusting again, responding to pressure with calculation. The pattern was no longer just about where the robberies occurred. It was about how the assailant moved between versions of himself, shifting tactics in response to fear and opportunity. That adaptability, once an advantage, was beginning to expose seams. The break came not through violence, but through routine. A city inspector conducting an unannounced safety check at a partially renovated warehouse near the river noticed a backpack tucked behind stacked drywall. Inside were gloves, a dark hooded jacket, and a metal bar wrapped in tape along one end. The items were not illegal on their own, but their presence in an unsecured building raised enough concern that the inspector notified police. By the time officers arrived, the building was empty. Colton examined the items under fluorescent light, aware that meaning often accumulated slowly rather than announcing itself. The gloves were a close match to the one recovered after the liquor store robbery. Same material and manufacturer, common enough to avoid immediate identification, but specific enough to matter. The jacket showed faint traces of insulation fibers and fine wood dust, consistent with the earlier lab findings. The metal bar bore no blood, but its weight and grip suggested familiarity rather than improvisation. The warehouse was tied to one of the small contracting firms Jack had flagged earlier. Employment records showed that several workers rotated through the site, depending on the phase of renovation. Among them was Colton Spear, a man whose name had surfaced once before during Troy's expanded review of emergency room injury reports. The coincidence was unsettling enough to warrant careful scrutiny rather than immediate action. Colton insisted on distance from the developing inquiry, recusing himself formally, and transferring oversight to a deputy chief. The decision was procedural and necessary, but it cast a quiet pall over the team. The overlap of names was likely incidental, but no one wanted the investigation compromised by even the appearance of bias. Troy took the lead on follow-up, reviewing the employment history connected to the warehouse. One worker stood out, a laborer with intermittent hours and a pattern of short-term contracts across Larkspur. His schedule aligned with the robbery windows, and his address sat near the loose center of Jack's revised geographic profile. The address was a small duplex on the west side, within walking distance of the hardware store. Lily reviewed the case file with renewed focus. The emerging suspect profile suggested a man whose work placed him in transitional spaces, buildings mid-change, environments where disorder was normalized. She considered how that might bleed into behavior, how constant exposure to unfinished structures and temporary arrangements could erode a sense of permanence. The robberies, in that light, looked less like a bid for profit and more like an attempt to impose order through force, however briefly. Surveillance was authorized quietly. Unmarked units observed the duplex over several evenings, noting routines rather than waiting for mistakes. The man left early each morning carrying work gear and returned before dusk, sometimes stopping at convenience stores along the way. He did not linger or behave erratically. His normalcy was complete, which made it harder to reconcile with the violence of the robberies. Jack cross-referenced the suspect's movements with cell tower pings obtained through a limited warrant. The data showed presence near each robbery location within an hour of the incidents, never directly at the scene but close enough to matter. It was circumstantial, but the pattern tightened. The pause in robberies stretched into a second week. Public anxiety eased slightly, though businesses maintained altered hours and private security contracts. The department resisted the urge to act prematurely, aware that a failed arrest could undo months of work and push the assailant into flight. Then, on a Tuesday evening, a silent alarm tripped at a small check-cashing outlet near the edge of town. Patrol units were already nearby, part of a new strategy to cluster response without advertising presence. Officers arrived within 90 seconds and found the front window shattered but no one inside. A trail of fresh footprints led toward an adjacent construction site. Troy coordinated the perimeter while other units moved cautiously through the site. They found the suspect crouched behind stacked pallets, backpack on the ground, breathing hard but uninjured. He did not resist arrest. The metal bar was inside the backpack, along with cash bands consistent with the outlet's registers. In custody, the man's demeanor was flat, almost relieved. Medical staff noted fresh cuts on his hands, superficial but numerous, consistent with forced entry. The evidence, accumulated patiently over weeks, converged without drama. Lily prepared the charges with precision, stacking counts that reflected both the robberies and the injuries inflicted. She noted that the violence, while instrumental, met thresholds that carried significant weight. The case no longer hinged on interpretation, but on fact. As the paperwork moved forward, Colton remained removed from direct involvement, observing from the margins. He understood that the investigation's success depended on restraint as much as pursuit, on allowing patterns to reveal themselves rather than forcing conclusions. The city exhaled cautiously as news of the arrest spread. There were no celebrations, only a muted sense of relief. The robberies had not been random acts of chaos, but the product of a mind that adjusted and learned, pressing against boundaries until they pushed back. The truth, when it finally emerged fully, would be simpler than the fear that preceded it, and more unsettling for its ordinariness. The man arrested at the construction site was named Troy Marino, a fact that initially caused confusion within the department before records clarified the overlap of names. He was 32 years old, employed sporadically by small contracting firms that specialized in renovations too minor for larger crews. His work history was uneven, marked by periods of steady labor followed by gaps attributed to layoffs, injuries, or contracts that ended abruptly. He lived alone in the West Side duplex, a space sparsely furnished and carefully maintained. Search warrants executed the following morning yielded no dramatic discoveries. There were no trophies, no elaborate plans pinned to walls. What investigators found instead were practical remnants. Spare gloves identical to those recovered earlier were stored in a kitchen drawer. A hooded jacket hung behind the bathroom door, fibers embedded deep in the seams. Cash was hidden in small amounts throughout the apartment, tucked into toolboxes and between folded work clothes, never exceeding a few $100s in any one place. The simplicity of the environment mirrored the simplicity of the motive that emerged during the investigation. Financial records showed mounting pressure. Irregular income had collided with medical debt from a workplace injury the year before, followed by the loss of a vehicle that limited job options. The robberies began shortly after a final notice from a collections agency. The timeline was not an excuse, but it was a framework. Psychological evaluations conducted after the arrest painted a picture of someone who experienced control as fragile and temporary. Troy did not describe anger in the way investigators often heard it. Instead, he described a sense of narrowing, a belief that his options were closing faster than he could adjust. The robberies were framed, in his own accounting, as tasks. Enter, disable, take, leave. The violence was not emotional release, but a means to an end, calibrated to minimize resistance rather than to punish. This explanation aligned with the evidence. The injuries inflicted during the robberies were severe, but targeted, aimed at preventing pursuit or interference. There was no escalation toward gratuitous harm, only an increase in force, as earlier levels proved insufficient. Each adjustment reflected learning rather than loss of control. The shift away from the river corridor was explained by increased patrols that disrupted familiar routes. The hardware store robbery marked the first significant deviation, driven by necessity rather than strategy. Surveillance footage from that incident showed a brief pause after the owner fell, a moment where Troy appeared to register the human cost more fully than before. Subsequent robberies returned to quicker exits and less direct engagement. The backpack recovered at the warehouse had been stored there deliberately, a staging point close to multiple targets. The glove left behind at the liquor store was a mistake acknowledged later as the first time he realized the pattern might collapse. From that point on, the pauses between robberies lengthened as caution replaced urgency. Colton Spear reviewed the final report after the case was closed, reading it not as a lead investigator, but as a record of restraint and process. The near coincidence of names had been a distraction, nothing more. The real through line of the case was not chance, but proximity. Troy had operated within spaces he understood, buildings in transition, neighborhoods accustomed to change. He moved through them without drawing attention because he belonged to them. In court, the evidence unfolded without surprise. Surveillance footage, fiber analysis, cell data, and recovered cash formed a coherent narrative. The victims testified to their injuries without embellishment. There were no revelations beyond what the investigation had already established. Sentencing followed months later. The cumulative weight of the charges ensured a lengthy prison term. There was no statement offered beyond a brief acknowledgement of responsibility. The proceedings concluded without spectacle. Larkspur returned gradually to its routines. Businesses adjusted hours back toward normal, patrols thinned, and the river trail resumed its role as a place of exercise rather than anxiety. The warehouses continued their slow transformation. Walls closed up, insulation hidden, dust swept away. The case ended not with a moral reckoning, but with a ledger balanced by facts. A series of violent robberies, once diffuse and threatening, resolved into a single figure whose actions were shaped by pressure, adaptation, and choice. When the pattern was fully understood, it ceased to expand. Now let's hop into the next story for tonight. The call came from a mailbox that had been sealed shut for nearly a year. It belonged to a roadside drop box at the edge of a rural county, the kind once used for after-hours tax payments before everything moved online. The metal slot had been welded closed after repeated vandalism. No one was supposed to be able to put anything inside it. At 6:11 a.m., a sanitation worker unlocked the outer panel as part of a scheduled removal and found a single envelope resting at the bottom. It was white, uncreased, and addressed in block letters to the county assessor's office. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed a man kneeling in tall grass, hands bound behind his back, his face turned toward the camera. He was alive when the photo was taken. His eyes were open. His expression was not panic, but recognition, as if he understood something the photographer did not need to explain. Written on the back was a time, nothing else. By the time deputies identified the man, the time had already passed. His name was Joel Hargreave, 43. He worked as a land surveyor for a private firm contracted by the county, spending most of his days walking property lines with measuring equipment and colored flags. He lived alone in a rental house outside town and paid his bills automatically. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, no social footprint beyond work. His body was found exactly where the photograph suggested it would be. He lay at the edge of a field slated for development, positioned just beyond the survey stakes he had placed the previous week. His hands were still bound. There were no signs of struggle in the grass around him. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of the head, delivered once, cleanly. Investigators noted something immediately unsettling. Joel's boots were off. They had been placed side by side several feet away, toes aligned with the nearest boundary marker. His socks were clean. The ground was dry. He had not been dragged. He had removed them himself. The field belonged to no one yet. It sat between ownerships, caught in the slow administrative process of rezoning and sale. It was land in transition, valued more on paper than in use. Joel had been there to make it legible, to translate acreage into coordinates that could be argued over. The photograph became the center of the case. Metadata placed it less than an hour before Joel's death. The angle suggested the photographer had been standing, calm, with time to frame the shot. There was no blur, no haste. The light was even. Morning. The envelope showed no fingerprints. When investigators returned to the drop box, they found faint scrape marks along the inside seam. Someone had opened it recently, not by force, but with familiarity. Someone who knew how it had been sealed. County maintenance logs revealed that the welding had been done by an outside contractor. The name on the invoice matched no one currently employed. By nightfall, the photo had not been released to the public, but the rumor of it had already spread. People spoke about the time written on the back as if it were a warning ignored rather than a record submitted. What unsettled the sheriff most was not the violence. It was the order. Joel Hargreave had been documented, positioned, and filed, like a completed form dropped into a system that no longer officially existed. And someone, somewhere, was still using it. The boots refused to leave the investigators' thoughts. Joel Hargreave had walked miles a day in those boots. He wore them until the soles thinned, until the leather molded to the exact shape of his feet. Taking them off in the middle of a field served no practical purpose. It was not comfort. It was compliance. The bindings on his wrists were examined next. Nylon cord, hardware store grade, tied with a knot that was secure but not complex. Easy to tighten. easy to remove, if allowed. The knot sat neatly against his skin, no sign of panic or repeated tightening. Joel had not fought it, or he had been convinced there was no point. Investigators canvassed the surrounding properties. The field was bordered by a dirt access road used by farm equipment and utility trucks. Tire impressions were plentiful and useless. No one reported hearing anything unusual. The strike that killed Joel would have been quick and quiet. A single blow. No shouting, no chase. The photograph became more troubling the longer it was studied. Joel's posture was upright, despite kneeling. His shoulders were back. His head was level. He was not slumped or bracing for impact. He looked prepared in a way that did not align with fear. Whatever had happened before the photograph had resolved something for him, or convinced him that resistance was finished. The time written on the back matched the estimated moment of death within minutes. Not a prediction. A schedule. Investigators pulled every recent job Joel had worked. He had surveyed dozens of parcels in the past year, most of them routine. Fence lines. Small subdivisions. Agricultural land changing hands quietly. But one cluster stood out, a sequence of jobs tied to a long-stalled development project that had changed ownership repeatedly without ever breaking ground. Each time the land changed hands, Joel had been sent back out. Each time he adjusted markers by inches, sometimes feet, as boundaries were renegotiated. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just the slow reshaping of lines that determined who gained and who lost. Those lines had consequences. A review of zoning disputes connected to the project revealed a pattern of quiet conflict. Adjacent landowners filed objections. Easements were contested. Access roads argued over endlessly. The disputes did not involve Joel directly, but his work defined the arguments. His stakes were the physical proof. He had been present at several contentious site meetings, standing off to the side while lawyers and developers argued. Witnesses remembered him as silent, focused, never engaging beyond what his job required. He moved markers when instructed, recorded changes, and left. One property owner remembered something else. During a heated exchange months earlier, Joel had removed his boots before stepping into a muddy area to reset a marker. The man had joked about it at the time, asking whether Joel was afraid to get them dirty. Joel had replied calmly that boots carried lines, and sometimes it was better not to cross them unnecessarily. The comment had seemed odd then. Now it felt deliberate. Investigators turned their attention back to the drop box. County records confirmed that the welding work had been performed by a contractor hired during a facilities consolidation effort years earlier. The contractor had dissolved shortly afterward. No forwarding address, no successor. The work order included a note indicating that the box's internal lock had been left functional, in case of future use. Future use by whom was not specified. The idea that someone had been waiting for an opportunity to use a closed system unsettled everyone involved. This was not someone improvising violence. This was someone inserting an act into a structure they believed still mattered. The photograph had not been sent to the police. It had been sent to an office that assessed land value. The implications settled slowly and heavily. Joel Hargreave had not been killed because of who he was. He had been killed because of where he stood, and because someone had decided that the line he represented needed to be corrected permanently. If that was true, the next act would not be random. It would be located, filed, and already decided. The county assessor's office had never been a place where urgency lived. Paper moved slowly there, even before most of it became digital. Appeals were logged, values adjusted, notices mailed weeks after decisions were made. It was a repository, not a battleground. That was precisely why the photograph had been sent there. Someone wanted the death to be contextualized, not reacted to. Investigators began sitting in on assessment hearings, rezoning reviews, and land commission meetings, not looking for anger or threats, but for certainty. People who spoke as if outcomes were already settled. People who treated disputes as inefficiencies rather than disagreements. They found one. His name was Martin Klein. He was not a developer, nor a landowner in the traditional sense. He was a consultant, hired repeatedly by different parties to advise on, quote, boundary rationalization. He specialized in resolving disputed parcels by aligning historical claims with present use. On paper, his work reduced litigation. In practice, it often resulted in small but decisive shifts of land from one owner to another. Martin Klein never touched the land himself. He worked through recommendations. Joel Hargreaves' surveys appeared in nearly every file Klein had consulted on in the past 2 years. Not because Joel worked for him, but because Joel's measurements became the neutral ground on which Klein's arguments rested. A marker placed here instead of there. A boundary clarified just enough to remove ambiguity. At 3 meetings, witnesses recalled Klein questioning Joel directly, not aggressively, but with a quiet insistence on precision. He asked whether Joel was certain of his readings, whether older markers had been considered, whether alternate interpretations existed. Joel had answered carefully. He had not budged. Investigators learned that one of Klein's long-term clients had recently lost a significant claim when Joel's final survey fixed a boundary permanently, closing the door on further adjustment. The loss was not catastrophic, but it was final. The land moved out of negotiation and into record. That mattered. When deputies visited Klein's office, they found it empty but not abandoned. The desk was clear, the computer wiped. Filing cabinets held only duplicate public documents. On the wall hung a framed map of the county, annotated with thin pencil lines that tracked not roads or parcels, but disputes. Some were crossed out, others were circled. The field where Joel died was circled twice. The boots returned again and again in investigators' discussions. Joel had taken them off because he believed in that moment that he was being asked to step out of his role, to remove the instrument that carried authority. Bare feet on land suggested humility, negotiation, a reset. Someone had convinced him that doing so mattered. Phone records placed Klein's burner phone within range of the field that morning. It had pinged the nearest tower for exactly 9 minutes, then gone dark. The phone had never been used again. The photograph's framing made sense now. Joel was kneeling at the boundary he had fixed, no longer wearing the boots that enforced it. He had been positioned as someone acknowledging correction. The time written on the back was not a threat, it was a filing time. Investigators believed Klein had staged the act as a form of administrative closure, eliminating what he saw as an immovable obstacle. Joel had not been attacked in rage. He had been processed, step by step, through a logic that treated people the same way it treated land. What remained unclear was whether Klein had intended the photograph to stop the process or continue it. Because when investigators searched the assessor's intake logs, they found something else. Another envelope had been logged that morning. It had not yet been opened. The envelope had been sitting in the intake tray for less than an hour. It matched the first in every detail. Same paper, same block lettering, same absence of postage. The clerk who logged it assumed it was a delayed duplicate and set it aside for review later in the day. No one questioned it because nothing about it looked urgent. Inside was another photograph. This one showed an empty field. No person, no violence. Just survey flags moving slightly in the wind, their colors bright against dry grass. At the center of the frame was a single wooden stake, newly driven, its top marked with fresh pencil lines. The angle was deliberate, taken from standing height, as if the photographer had stepped back to check alignment. Written on the back was a time. It was in the future. Investigators cleared the assessor's office within minutes and traced the coordinates embedded in the photograph's metadata. The field sat 30 miles away, part of a contested parcel that had been under review for years. No one lived there. No development had begun. It was land that existed only in meetings and documents, valuable precisely because it was unresolved. The time written on the photograph corresponded to a scheduled site visit, Joel Hargreaves' replacement. Officers arrived early, spreading out along the access road, hiding their vehicles among hedgerows and equipment sheds. The field was quiet, empty, exactly as the photograph had shown it. Flags stood where they had been left weeks earlier. The new stake was there too, clean and sharp, placed with care. At the appointed time, a man walked into the field alone. It was Martin Klein. He carried no weapon. He wore dress shoes unsuitable for uneven ground. In knowing contrast to Joel, he kept them on as he crossed the boundary line, stepping directly over the markers without slowing. He stopped at the stake, looked down, and nodded once, as if confirming a calculation. He knelt. That was when officers moved in. Klein did not resist. He seemed almost relieved, rising slowly, brushing dirt from his trousers. When asked why he had come, he answered without hesitation. He said he was closing a file. He said the photograph had been misunderstood. He said the process required demonstration, not repetition. When confronted with Joel Hargreaves' death, Klein corrected the language gently. He said Joel had been shown the consequences of inflexibility. He said no one had intended for things to go that far. He said accidents happen when lines were drawn too tightly. The lie was thin and unnecessary. In Klein's possession was a small notebook containing times, locations, and parcel numbers. No names, just references that only someone fluent in land records would understand. Joel's entry was crossed out. The next was not. The case closed quickly after that. There was no trial spectacle. The evidence was procedural and overwhelming. Klein's defense collapsed under the weight of its own logic, unable to reconcile administrative language with physical harm. He was sentenced without flourish, his acts described plainly as premeditated homicide. The assessor's office changed its intake procedures. The old drop box was removed entirely. Surveyors began working in pairs. Boundaries remained contested, but the people drawing them were no longer invisible. The field where Joel Hargreaves died returned to disuse. Grass grew back over the impressions left by kneeling and boots and careful placement. Flags faded. Stakes loosened and tilted, their lines no longer exact. Eventually, no one could agree where the boundary had been meant to fall, and for the first time in years, that uncertainty remained. Not because someone enforced it, but because no one was willing to decide it alone.